Hello, and welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. When I was training, one of my mentors used to say, "It doesn't matter if you know what to call it. It just matters that you know how to treat it." I've reflected on that statement several times over my career, and while it's helped me deal with the uncertainty of managing complex cases and diagnostic uncertainty, I do think naming matters. It helps us as physicians and scientists communicate consistently, and naming also helps people living with autoimmune diseases understand what's going on in their body. The manuscript we'll discuss today is Recommendations for Aligned Nomenclature of Peripheral Nervous System Disorders across Rheumatology and Neurology. It was published in Arthritis and Rheumatology, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures can be found in our show notes from today. I'm excited to be joined by two of the authors of this manuscript, Dr. Gaith Noirser and Ms. Catherine Hammett. Gaith Noirser is an associate professor of allergy, clinical immunology, and rheumatology at the Kansas University Medical Center. Dr. Noirser is originally from Syria and completed his internship in laboratory medicine at Tishreen University Hospital. He subsequently completed an internship and residency at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, where he also served as chief resident. He was then a hospitalist at the Cleveland Clinic for several years before completing a fellowship in rheumatology at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2012, he joined the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where he worked in the Lupus Center and established the UPMC Sjogren's Clinic. He has now moved to my favorite part of the country, Kansas, where he leads the KU Sjogren's Clinic. And Ms. Cathy Hammett is a former television news producer and writer holding an MA in journalism from the University of Missouri-Columbia, as well as a graduate certificate in publishing from Radcliffe College and Harvard University. I have had the pleasure of working with Cathy in her role as Vice President of Medical and Scientific Affairs at the Sjogren's Foundation, where she oversees key medical and scientific initiatives to increase knowledge about Sjogren's disease. She coordinates the development of clinical practice guidelines in Sjogren's, a major foundation initiative aimed at providing a roadmap for managing and treating the disease. She also leads the Foundation's Clinical Trials Consortium, an international initiative that collaborates closely with clinicians, medical centers, industry, and the federal government to develop new therapies for Sjogren's disease. Cathy has co-authored numerous books, articles, and textbook chapters on Sjogren's, and Cathy was also diagnosed with Sjogren's about 30 years ago. As she advocated for change herself, she also focused on empowering others to take an active role in their illness and to bring the international community together to create change. Welcome to the show, Gaith and Cathy.
Thank you for having us.
I'm delighted to be here, so thank you for having me as well.
So, Cathy, I wanted to start the conversation with you. You've been an advocate for Sjogren's for longer than I've been a rheumatologist. And some years ago, you started a process that led to a critical nomenclature change from referring to the disease as Sjogren's syndrome to referring to it as Sjogren's disease. Explain to us why it was crucial to advocate for this name change.
Well, as you indicate, language matters. It shapes how patients and their friends, family, colleagues all see the burden of a disease. It shapes how clinicians approach that disease. And as you also mentioned, it shapes how we communicate with one another. So the name we give a disease matters, and the way we describe it matters on absolutely every level and for all stakeholders. So we often hear from patients that their doctors did not take them or their symptoms seriously. Instead, they were sometimes told that Sjogren's was merely a nuisance and involved some dry eyes and dry mouth, but that couldn't be too bad. So patients rarely felt seen or their experience acknowledged or validated. And this also often was our experience as a foundation with our interactions with healthcare professionals. Even rheumatologists really didn't understand the depth and breadth of symptoms and the systemic nature of the disease. Then also our knowledge about Sjogren's has evolved. Sjogren's is a distinct autoimmune disease with characteristic autoantibodies, glandular histopathology, and pattern of systemic involvement. On the other hand, a syndrome is an aggregate of symptoms and signs independent of pathogenesis. So this was okay in 1935, 2 years after Dr. Henrique Sjogren published his thesis identifying a triad of dry eye, dry mouth, and arthritis. But now we know so much more about the etiology and pathogenesis, and that Sjogren's is a systemic disease. And the international community recognized that it was now medically and scientifically appropriate to use the term disease. And I just wanted to mention that the Sjogren's Foundation actually started by changing our foundation name and dropping syndrome. Then in 2021, Dr. Alan Baer, our medical and scientific advisory chair, and I published a letter in Arthritis and Rheumatism called Disease Not Syndrome. Then we launched the international collaboration that ended up involving 81 health professionals from 28 countries and nearly 1,500 patients from 23 countries. So we are thrilled that our final international consensus was just published, and the name change will have a major impact on patients and the clinicians who manage them.
I totally agree, and I'm so thankful for you doing this work. The Sjogren's Foundation is also working to develop clinical practice guidelines for Sjogren's. Could you share some background on that process and how it relates to the work described in this manuscript that specifically examines the alignment of nomenclature for peripheral nervous system disorders in Sjogren's?
Sure. Sjogren's, more than other rheumatic diseases, really requires so many different specialists to be involved in patient care. When we first identified the need in 2009 for development of clinical practice guidelines in Sjogren's, the ACR was incredibly helpful, sharing its guideline methodology and offering input as we forged a process to address a multi-system disease. So first, we needed consistency and better quality of care for patients. Many rheumatologists actually were uncomfortable treating Sjogren's patients, and guidelines provided that guidance that was so needed about what to do with the patient. Rheumatologists were traditionally trained to see Sjogren's as a dry eye, dry mouth disease, which is inaccurate because it's so much more than that. So we started by putting together multidisciplinary panels, and we first addressed ocular guidelines published by the Ocular Surface, oral guidelines published by the American Dental Association's journal. A&R then published our guidelines on the use of biologics, use of DMARDs, and fatigue in Sjogren's, and pulmonary guidelines were published in chest. Then we started our efforts in peripheral nervous system guidelines with a panel split between rheumatology and neurology. And we started running into the issue of each specialty having its own terminology for neurological involvement. For example, the neurologists would start talking about neurological manifestations, and the rheumatologists would jump in and say, "Hey, wait a minute, what are you talking about? What do you mean by that term?" And that was a real aha moment for all of us. And we realized that no wonder communication was difficult between specialists. They didn't speak the same language. This meant that collaboration for good patient care was really hampered, and the language everyone used created a major barrier to uptake in real world practice.
I think that's so true. Gates, I wanted to loop you in now. You serve on the Clinical Practice Guidelines Committee charged with developing these peripheral nervous system practice guidelines. Can you fill us in on some of the background from your point of view? There are a lot of different peripheral neuropathies described associated with Sjogren's disease. Why was it essential to rethink how we name and classify them?
Certainly. Well, first, peripheral neuropathy is a major issue in Sjogren's. In fact, neuropathies can occur in a substantial proportion of Sjogren's patients. Historically, as Kathy outlined earlier, clinicians and researchers have used a confusing mix of terms to describe Sjogren's related neuropathies. Early on in the guidelines development process, and as the team delved into the literature review phase, we realized that without a common language, rheumatologists and neurologists might not always be on the same page. Therefore, it became essential to rethink the nomenclature to make sense of the data. By standardizing how we name and classify these neuropathies, we improve communication across specialties and ensure we are all talking about the same entities. With everyone using shared definitions, we can communicate and collaborate more effectively with the ultimate goal of improving patients' care and homogenizing future literature.
And how did the team approach this work?
We approached this project very systematically. First, the Sjogren's Foundation pulled together a diverse panel of experts, including rheumatologists and neurologists with particular expertise in managing Sjogren's disease, to ensure all perspectives were represented. We began with a comprehensive literature search to gather all the evidence on peripheral neuropathies and Sjogren's. The search quickly revealed a problem that there was a scant high quality evidence and a lot of inconsistent terminology out there. So, from the get go, we knew we would be leaning heavily on expert consensus to fill gaps. The team then went through a process of data collection and refinement, essentially distilling the information and deciding how to categorize it in a more uniform way. We identified where multiple terms were referring to the same concept and where definitions needed clarification. After refining a proposed set of definitions and categories, we moved into consensus development, which involved a lot of group meetings, discussions, and iterative revisions. We used an evidence based guideline development process, which meant formulating questions, reviewing whatever data existed, and then voting on recommendations. Contentious points were debated with reference to whatever evidence was available, and compromises were made to achieve clarity and consensus. Importantly, the process was transparent and rigorous to ensure the final product would be credible to the broader medical community. And in the end, it took us quite a long time to get from kickoff to a finished product. That time was spent ensuring that every recommendation and definition had group buy in, and we were simplifying the nomenclature in a way that made sense scientifically and clinically. Following this systemic process, so we arrived at a set of guidelines and a nomenclature alignment that everyone on the panel fully endorsed.
Yeah, and Table 2 in the manuscript outlines the proposed aligned nomenclature. It's fabulous because you go through each of the 7 types of neuropathy. You outline the terminology, definitions, describe the clinical presentation and what testing should be done. Could you talk us through it for those who are listening?
Yeah, absolutely. Table 2 provides a clear breakdown of 7 categories of peripheral neuropathy recognized in Sjogren's disease. Each category is listed with its definition, clinical presentation, relevant etiologies, and recommended evaluation procedures. The 7 types include the following: mononeuropathy, large fiber or axonal neuropathy, small fiber neuropathy, demyelinating polyradiculoneuropathy, ganglionopathy, vasculitic neuropathy, and finally, autonomic neuropathy. Let's take the example of vasculitic neuropathy in Table 2. You will see synonymous terms or quote unquote other nomenclature in the table. In this case, you'll see multiple mononeuropathy or mononeuritis multiplex as alternative terms used historically. Then you will see a definition. In this case, vasculitic neuropathy represent neuropathies associated with histologic evidence of vasculitic process involving the peripheral nerves. Next, clinical presentation is described. In this case, asymmetric, often painful, acute, and occasionally subacute presentation. Next, we delve into proposed pathophysiology, differential diagnosis, and then brief diagnostic evaluation. In this case, we briefly discussed the role of nerve and muscle biopsy, EMG findings, and the role of laboratory testing. I think by standardizing these definitions and recommended tests, Table 2 becomes a practical checklist for clinicians and provider. A clinician can simply identify which category a Sjogren's patient's neuropathy fits and know the appropriate next steps. In this example, recognizing a painful asymmetric neuropathy as likely vasculitic and pursuing a nerve biopsy. This can also facilitate communication, as rheumatologists and internists can now clearly convey the type of neuropathy to neurologists and vice versa, using shared vocabulary. Ultimately, walking through Table 2 in practice means speaking the same language about peripheral nerve involvement in Sjogren's, which is exactly what these guidelines are attempting to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's great. And how, I guess, do you as a rheumatologist see this work being applied to clinicians practicing rheumatology at the bedside?
In my opinion, the new nomenclature and guidelines are poised to significantly enhance clinical practice for rheumatologists and internists managing Sjogren's patients. I think this work provides a clear framework for identifying and evaluating peripheral neuropathies in Sjogren's patients. For example, a rheumatologist in clinic can now reference the guidelines categories from mononeuropathy to autonomic neuropathy to determine what type of neuropathic involvement a patient might have. And this can inform which diagnostic steps to take, such as ordering nerve conduction study or skin biopsy. One immediate application is earlier and more accurate diagnosis. Vague symptoms like limb numbness or dizziness are quite common in Sjogren's. With these guidelines, physicians are reminded that such symptoms in a patient with known Sjogren's could indicate neuropathy subtype that warrant further workup. Another key impact is on interdisciplinary communication and collaboration. And what I mean by that is by creating such a shared and common vocabulary for Sjogren's peripheral nervous system manifestations, a rheumatologist can confidently communicate to a neurologist that, for example, I suspect vasculitic neuropathy, or this patient might have a ganglionopathy, while both understanding each other precisely. On the other hand, neurologists recognizing these terms are more likely to consider Sjogren's in the differential if not already diagnosed, potentially leading to a rheumatology referral. It's like a two-way street that the Sjogren's Foundation explicitly hope to foster. And in summary, the guidelines are applied in practice as both a diagnostic compass and a communication tool. By doing so, they elevate the standard of care, really, with patients benefiting from a quicker recognition of complications and more coordinated management, while clinicians benefiting from a clear and consensus-driven roadmap. The ultimate goal here and hopefully expected outcome is that Sjogren's patients with peripheral nervous system involvement will no longer fall through the cracks. Instead, using these guidelines, rheumatologists and internists will catch neuropathies earlier and manage them in a more unified manner, bridging the gap between specialties and improving outcomes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is something that I can see people referring back to throughout their practice, actually a really important resource. So, Kathy, this really was an amazing undertaking. You were able to bring people together to reach consensus. Tell us how the work is going to be disseminated to other communities outside of rheumatology, and particularly to patients who are dealing with these confusing symptoms, and then to other specialties like neurology and other specialties that see people living with Sjogren's disease.
Yeah, the Sjogren's Foundation not only communicates about our work through our foundation's newsletter for patients, our journal for professionals, our website, and all of the social media venues that we now have available, but we have patients who are awareness ambassadors all around the country, and they personally deliver the latest materials we have to rheumatologists and other specialists in their geographical area. And just as we attend and exhibit and sometimes facilitate symposia on Sjogren's at the ACR convergence meetings, we periodically attend and exhibit at other specialty conferences put on by those professional organizations so that we raise awareness of the many manifestations of Sjogren's, and we encourage those specialists to coordinate and work with rheumatology to better manage their Sjogren's patients. We often disseminate information at the American Academy of Neurology and the American Autonomic Society meetings, for example. Then we have podcasts like this one that Dr. Noase and I are so delighted to participate in, and other media that focus on medicine and healthcare issues. They are also vital to helping spread the word. And we're absolutely thrilled that changes are already being made. The National Institutes of Health is now using disease. We're pleased with that. If you take a look on PubMed at articles on Sjogren's, the most recent publications show a real definitive trend to using the term disease.
Yeah, I think you've successfully permeated the community and gotten the word out, which is great. I'd like to take a moment now for our listeners to get to know both of you a little bit better. And Gaith, I wanted to start with you. Longtime listeners know I have a special affection for the University of Kansas. How long have you been at KU, and what made you want to practice rheumatology there?
I joined the faculty at the University of Kansas in 2019 after spending 7 years at the University of Pittsburgh. Interestingly, the move began with a kind email from my now division chief inviting me to visit and interview here, almost by coincidence. Coming from a well-established institution like Pitt with a long-standing reputation in rheumatology research as well as care, I wasn't sure what to expect. At the same time, my wife had been feeling the effect of Pittsburgh's persistently cloudy weather, and she encouraged me to explore other options. That visit to Kansas City quickly changed everything. I realized how much KU had to offer, not just in terms of academic opportunity, but also in its vibrant and collaborative culture. And it became clear that this was a place where I could grow professionally, continue my work in Sjogren's, and build meaningfully on what I had started at Pitt. And what's truly special is the caliber of people here. As a provider, you're literally surrounded by brilliant clinicians, researchers, and educators across every discipline. And beyond the walls of the institution, I've come to appreciate Kansas City as one of the most underrated, in my opinion, and pleasant places to live, especially for families. The schools are excellent, the restaurants diverse and inviting, and the cultural scene, including the orchestra, which is one of my main interests, is surprisingly very rich.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And since you bring up the restaurants, the most critical question, which my husband would never forgive me if I didn't ask you, Kansas City is famous for its barbecue. Which one is your favorite?
Well, in Kansas, picking a favorite barbecue joint is like choosing your favorite child, right? And it's controversial and bound to start a family feud. But if I had to choose, I think my wife and I agree that Jack Stack barbecue is probably the best. Customers literally camp out for brisket like there's no tomorrow. And frankly, with meat that good, who needs one?
Oh, my husband would be very happy to hear that. That is actually where we had our rehearsal dinner the night before our wedding. So
Wow.
also one of
Wow.
our favorites.
So on the same page in here, obviously.
So you currently direct the KU Sjogren's Clinic, which involves a collaboration with a multidisciplinary team of experts in otolaryngology, ophthalmology, neurology, pulmonary, and pathology. Is there a secret, dare I say, barbecue sauce that binds this team together?
Well, I think that the secret sauce of a successful multidisciplinary Sjogren's clinic is fundamentally effective and structured collaboration between the care team and a patient centered focus. To me, this means all specialists operate within a shared understanding of the disease and clear communication channels as they collectively formulate a comprehensive care plan. In our clinic, we coordinate scheduling so that a patient can, for instance, see relevant providers in one day or in a short span, particularly those who travel long distance to seek care, minimizing the burden on the patient and maximizing information sharing amongst providers. Another ingredient is mutual respect and cross education, with each specialist in the team having an appreciation for others' field of expertise. I think another point to highlight is individualized and patient centered treatment plans. And as you know, Vicky, Sjogren's disease is notably heterogeneous, and standardized treatment protocols are often insufficient to address the spectrum of patients' presentation. For some individuals, addressing Sjogren's related fatigue and treatment strategy is the center of the discussion, and such cases differ substantially from patients with, for example, rapidly progressive interstitial lung disease or cryoglobulinemic vasculitis, who may require prompt and aggressive immunosuppressive therapy. In all scenarios, patients' preference carries substantial weight in shaping the treatment plan, and every recommendation is thoughtfully tailored to the individual's clinical profile and personal goals. Another point to highlight is that in the context of a disease lacking FDA approved therapies, building a strong portfolio of clinical trials is essential to bridge this treatment gap. Participation research not only offer patients, in my opinion, a sense of hope and engagement, but also fosters a sense of contribution to the broader community. Even when outcomes are not positive, each trial generates valuable data that helps researchers and scientists refine future approaches, ultimately paving the way for more effective therapy. This is certainly a common discussion that I hold with my patients who are considering clinical trials for participation. Lastly, perhaps less tangible but critical factor is a commitment to a unified mission, with everyone on the team prioritizing Sjogren's as a serious and complex disease requiring collaboration between different disciplines.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And actually it reminds me of a quote that's actually on a plaque on a little plaza outside Building 1 at NIH. that says without research, there is no hope. And I think that's so true. So as a busy clinical practice, how have you been able to integrate research into the work that you've been doing? You talk about both lupus and Sjogren's clinical trials. How can you give advice to our listeners about how to balance a busy clinical practice and all the work that's required to run a clinical trial?
I've been intentional about making clinical research part of the routine care pathway rather than a separate silo. In our practice, we screen every patient for trial eligibility during regular visits, so participation becomes a natural part of the care experience and discussion of patients' care. What makes it manageable is surrounding myself with a strong team and keeping communication clear. Everyone knows their role, and that helps the clinic run smoothly, even when things get busy. Patients benefit from having access to emerging therapies without added stress, and we stay focused on care without losing momentum on research. I'm also fortunate to have supportive colleagues who refer complex patients to our clinic, individuals who often truly need clinical trial options discussed as part of their care. I think their trust and collaboration makes our research work both possible and purposeful.
Yeah, so true. Kathy, I wanted to come back to you now and ask a little bit more about your background. You're a writer and a television producer by trade. How did you end up getting involved with the Sjogren's Foundation?
Well, I got involved when I was diagnosed with Sjogren's. So when I was diagnosed, the internet was not yet a thing. So it was much harder to find information. The rheumatologist at the University of Virginia who diagnosed me bicycled home to get his medical school notes on Sjogren's. And when he got back to the clinic, there was only one short paragraph on Sjogren's. So, with a background in journalism and as a journalist, I was comfortable identifying and finding information. And so at that time, I engaged in research at a nearby university medical library and the National Library of Medicine. I learned about a dry eye clinical trial that way. And even though while my eyes were not yet subjectively dry, I recognized the importance of ensuring that we gain as much knowledge as possible. So I went to Boston for the dry eye trial. I could actually trace symptoms back to childhood, so it took a long time before I got my diagnosis. I commented to another patient who was in the trial that we really needed some kind of a foundation to help others as they were diagnosed and help them navigate this complicated disease. Well, that person was Elaine Harris, who told me she had just started a foundation. So
Amazing.
she pulled me in to help, and I have been involved ever since.
Oh, that's an incredible story, which kind of brings me to my next question, which was, are there any mentors who helped you on your journey to become an advocate?
Oh, so many mentors, and just like picking your favorite barbecue, it's difficult to pick your favorite mentor, but I've been really fortunate to have found another and very meaningful career. It wasn't one that I expected. I don't know if any of you remember read the Sesame Street books when they came out, but there was one about how when their child was born and had Down syndrome, instead of going to the planet or being in the world that they thought they were going to be, it was like navigating another world and another planet. And I look at that way too with a diagnoses such as Sjogren's. So I had a very different career from which I had trained, but I was able to use those skills, and I've loved the career that I've had. Other patients along the way and healthcare providers and researchers have all provided support, as well as becoming amazing collaborators as together we identify and then we work to address barriers to move the field of Sjogren's forward. Those at the National Institutes of Health were especially important and passionate about this, as were those at academic centers. So we also all recognize the importance of international partnerships and forging relationships around the world, because no one can really accomplish a lot in the disease space without that international collaboration. The first rheumatologist I had in Central Virginia, Dr. Jeff Wilson, was a wonderful partner. And we would race to see who could find more information and who could find it the fastest and the first one to find it. Dr. Elaine Alexander, who's no longer with us, but who was a rheumatologist as well as a neurologist, she and I worked early on to really work on the foundation and what the unique role that the Sjogren's Foundation could play in bringing different parties together and addressing barriers. And then we have former medical board chairs such as Dr. Fred Vivino and Nancy Carter, and Robert Fox is still very involved, and Dan Wallace serves on our board. And all of them have come with their sets of experiences, whether it's Sjogren's or another closely related disease that translates to Sjogren's. And one thing I loved about journalism was that I was constantly learning. And I also love that about my work in Sjogren's. I might have been in this field now for 30 years, but I learned something new all the time.
Yeah, and they're so lucky to have you doing this work and communicating the work out to the public. It's kind of amazing to me the work that Sjogren's Foundation has done, breaking down barriers to advance research on both Sjogren's disease and autoimmune diseases more generally. What's the next boundary that you're planning to tackle?
Well, we'll continue developing guidelines and involving other specialists in our work. That never ends because once you develop a guideline, it's already time to update that guideline. So we have worked hard to bring pulmonologists in and neurologists. We're working on CNS guidelines now. We still need to work with gastroenterologists and urogynecologists and nephrologists. There are just so many different specialists who could be diagnosing Sjogren's and making sure that referral is made to rheumatologists, but they're not necessarily doing that now because it's not on their radar or they don't have the knowledge to do that. We're starting to focus on developing centers of excellence that offer multi-specialty care and to nurture clinical and basic scientific research. As you mentioned in the beginning, we launched and head the Sjogren's Foundation International Clinical Trials Consortium to ensure new therapies reach the market. And in fact, we're really excited that we have a number of potential therapies in phase 3 clinical trials right now. And we hope to have our first systemic therapy out in another year to a year and a half. That is going to be a huge game changer for both patients and rheumatologists and all of those who care for Sjogren's patients.
Oh, that's so exciting to hear, and I can't wait to hear more. Kathy and Gaith, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your work. It's been an absolute pleasure having you both on the show.
Thank you, Vicky. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was an honor to be here, and I appreciate your helping us raise awareness of the important neurological manifestations of Sjogren's because, sometimes peripheral nervous system symptoms are the presenting symptoms in Sjogren's. So it's really important to recognize that whether you're already diagnosed with Sjogren's or whether you're not yet diagnosed. So thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. And our thanks today are also due to those who advocate at every level to support autoimmune disease research. As Kathy and Gaith has shown, advocacy occurs one conversation at a time, and its impact may take many years to become apparent, but it's vital to move our field forward. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow @ACRoom on social media. Email us at podcast@rheumatology.org and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.